Hello all, and now I wanted to part with Whitehead and look at a tinted, generalized characteristics of the different American pragmatists who follow Whitehead. Of course, if we want to be specific in regards to philosophical systems, we would point to Dewey first, as Dewey um, is into process metaphysics himself on a naturalist basis. However, I want to do it a little bit different and actually go through Peirce as opposed to the actual philosophical tenets, and I'll get to that in a little bit onto why that is. But so anyway, if you noticed with Whitehead, we really didn't discuss much in the ways of ethics, and there's a real reason for that, and that is because with regards to his impressive metaphysical system that he uses mathematics out of for objective data and possibilities to come about, there really is no personal agency, and of course that's a really big gape, if you will, with regards to how I think with regards to identity as a whole for Western civilization, if you will, personal agency, being able to put a signature and compared to the Eastern world, perhaps, certainly with regards to art, we want that personal identity towards these things. It's a great insult to sign things that aren't yours. Of course, that's fraudulent. But more than that, if Nietzsche signed this letter, then I want to know that Nietzsche personally signed the letter. It's a bit different in the Eastern world, where names are appropriated all the time. So I think it's interesting to look at what the pragmatists will turn to with that that personalization, if you will. Whereas Whitehead was more focused on possibilities and events, and we touched up a bit on the succession of memory towards identity for Whitehead. But just to summarize, when we think of Whitehead metaphysics with regards to novel events, novel creativity, what is something like attempting to learn a new skill, or going to a new classroom or a new school. There's loads of possibilities that could possibly happen, but the events in their succession, although Whitehead would actually say it doesn't have to be in a linear way, but he only presented it for us for the sake of presentability, I suppose. But you don't have to have that sort of linear inference in the way you think about these things. But the event radiates out that sort of possible vibrancy, if you will. And now, if we return to the characteristics of American pragmatism, I suppose the very vulgar three-word explanation would be experience over theory, using the actual experience and the practicality of the access of testing theory, of testing methods, of using our experience in our evaluation of truth. This is, of course, the turn of modernity here, really, with scientific revolution, changing again. So we talk about that relationship with science. We'll get into that more later in an actual historical fashion, but you can see, we're on the offset of the scientific method really being the basis of epistemology. And so, just to give a couple remarks, I do think that this is a pretty, fitting time to look at these American pragmatist thinkers, considering, the free fall, if you will, of trying to find, what it means to be an American. What are the redeeming qualities and also qualms, if you will, towards, the nation as a whole, and what it means to be in this nation. That's something I wanted to emphasize on before we actually looked at the thinkers themselves. What are these qualities? Who are we as a nation at this point, and where we come from, if you will, from these thinkers. And so, to start, we're going to look at Charles Peirce. He was a scientist, pragmaticist, as opposed to a pragmatist, even though he's lauded as the father of pragmatism. The differences there is that, unlike Dewey and William James, his pragmaticism, if you will, has objective moral value. That there's an objectiveness to the universe, to our moral goodness. And he uses, of course, as a scientist, the scientific knowledge, the scientific method of using modulation, using experimentation towards the models that and ideas that we have. And so he's very much into that experimentation of trying to reconstruct what the possibilities of an argument for what belief and truth is. And that's really what his essays talk about, is the scientific method as a way to stabilize belief, since belief could be seen, if you will, as drifting between these different ways of thinking, of answers, if you will, to these questions. He believes that the scientific method can be used to stabilize those beliefs, and that's really how he comes about with his pragmatism and is lauded as such. The way he does this is with the practicality of consequences. If your model's wrong, then there's going to be consequences, certainly as a scientist. And so if you want to know what an idea means, you have to practice, use the praxium in a Marxist way, if you will, terminology, to finding what the truth and the meaning to these things are. And so for him, the way you do about this, there's only one way, of course, the scientific method, to truly go about it, and the other three ways aren't sufficient enough for him. One, of course, is to be dogmatic and not to change your mind at all to a new idea. The second is interesting, I think, towards what I was just talking about with regards to American identity, and that is that there is a conflict of authorities within a society. There's different authoritarian expertise, if you will, of knowledge dispensed, and there's competing power centers, if you will. You don't have to look at it necessarily from just a social theory aspect, but in the conflict of authority between a mother and a father, if you will. Sometimes a family unit doesn't necessarily agree with each other, and so there's authority can't really be enough to sufficiently withstand what is actually true. And so for his third is really norms or tradition. And, this is to basically say, we should just stick to the same thing. There's very much that sort of creative and novelty energy here towards, going away from tradition, stepping outside of it and establishing new norms. And of course, the fourth is the scientific method, and that is the confirmation of a hypothesis appeal. For him, of course, he suggests that we can appeal to the evidence towards observers. There's kind of a way of looking at how, perhaps in his time, how much more educated the American public was as a whole. And so, actually, having a society that is, more cohesive, more in line together, if you will, even on an ethnic level, I think you can appeal more towards evidence, and I certainly think that that's something that's true here with regards to Peirce and the turn of the century at the time. Whereas in today's world, I think it's very different to have public evidence just out and abound like that really doesn't get entangled, if you will, with number two, really, with his regards to just appeal to authority. That's interesting to maybe look at. And so he has an issue, if you will, with foundationalism, those, classic first principles. Because, philosophy, or the Cartesian mode of thinking, if you will, started off with universal doubt. It starts off with skepticism. Western thought really gets going with Descartes, alone in his with the heated stove, if you will. And so, for Peirce, you just need the practicality of whether or not it's a model that, and really knowing everything without doubt isn't really necessary for him. You can use the scientific method for that. And so you just have, the doubt for certainty. And he draws the distinction that's interesting with the scholastics of the Middle Ages, who were much more robust about speculation and argumentation with Aquinas, where he creates all these different arguments that come together in that sort of fashion, where scholasticism, has that sort of inquiry, as opposed to philosophy really just claiming, that there's just kind of a divine intervention, if you will. Him draw that critique of philosophy and divorce it from the scholastic inquiry, as it were. But harking back towards Descartes and his mathematical method for mechanisms of knowledge, what was the heyday method at the time to use mathematical proofs to deduct into your philosophy. This is to, of course, look at how methodologies in this realm of thought changes over time, and you can see with Bacon, perhaps, where he uses induction and there's the linear inference of this presupposes this, and that sort of argumentation in his revolution. You can see with Descartes and mathematics and the mechanisms of atomistic ideas and the romance to follow that in the atomized world. Now we turn to the methodological, the components of different relations, the interconnectedness of them, and its experimentation. And so, the scientific method, being able to test these models for their clear and distinctness, and knowing what it means, as opposed to I know what you mean. And since this is something that is universally applicable, if you will, then this is something that can be universalized out and into his morality, if you will. But if we were going to shift now towards John Dewey, for Dewey, he has similar critiques, but his emphasis more is on the process of experience, and so he looks at Locke as really someone who sees thought as a spectator sport, as opposed to active involvement. You can kind of see with Dewey that there is definitely a precursor, if you will, to cognition, and certainly with James, as we'll see, seeing that the brain isn't just this passive, going back towards, I think, with John Locke, with his influence towards Stoicism, with the imprint of the tabula rasa, the blank slate, the imprint of the wax for the Stoics, for Aurelius, if you will, and its impressions out of that. Well, now, as we've gone forward, we see that the mind is much more active. It's not just a spectator, it's actually very much involved. And so experience is an activity, and it's not passively done. And so Dewey also, suggests that, for pragmatic purposes, on those grounds alone, we don't actually want philosophical confidence, because of the practicality that experience can give to that individual ego, if you will. And that's, goes back to experience being reality. Dewey converts Hegelianism, or is taking, much like how Whitehead used with Bradley in the Anglosphere, he's using Josiah Royce, who was really an American Hegelian, to a synthesis of pragmatism that is emphasizing on the relationships around us. And so his methodology is through that universal scientific method to apply to all inquiry. And so we can reconstruct out of that into a universal application of scientific logic. And then if we are going to hark now to William James, he is actually different in his theism. He takes that limited God approach, as compared to Dewey's naturalism of process within, evolution and the theory of natural selection. Obviously, there's no static form if you have a natural process of selection that's in movement. And so James is interesting, I think, in his own right, as we are going to talk about identity here, with how he never really actually studied philosophy as much as he really was a psychologist in his day, despite the fact that he held philosophy department positions. Many of these journals at the time were referred to for philosophy, science, and psychology, or the human condition. And so James is that branch of that tradition towards studying experimentation in the human condition. And it's interesting to see his famous metaphor that probably deserves to get more recognition in the American culture, is that he has that stream of conscious metaphor that I think you see throughout American art and its visualizations of the Mississippi or something like that, and that the stream and the flow of psychology, if you will. Concrete experience is a process, and it's not so much what you were actually thinking, but what do you actually feel about these things? How do you feel about this video? How do you feel about me? How do you feel about the nation state? How do you feel about Americanism? That's something that William James and the consciousness of his interest. And so for him, satisfaction of hope has its value in truth, with that workability of pragmatism there. And I think maybe there is that sort of critique, certainly, that you could see. And it's also interesting to give a little bit of a feedback with regards to how, when I was originally introduced to these ideas, even 10 or so years ago, how much, we've truly changed even since then, let alone since William James or the American Pragmatists. And that's, the confidence in the idea that you can have, satisfaction of individualized, personalized workability towards your own truth. And I think a lot of people would have, a problem with that today in the culture at hand. Even people who don't, agree with us to any stretch. I think if you, peered into our opposition or leftist, if you will, I don't think that they're for the personalized, our personalized truths or our self-understanding. And so it's interesting to see, just like how with Peirce, that appeal towards almost that kind of democratic, self-evidence in front of you. It's a little bit more complicated when you don't have that sort of cohesiveness in an actual culture anymore. And I think that really ties into the idea of, if you just stand for what works at the time, what makes of the actual subjects themselves, who are these people, and what's their history. And I think that within these bright thinkers themselves and their qualities, the questioning of authority in that Jeffersonian sense goes back throughout our history of rebellion, if you will, of authority. There is also the fact that you won't ever really establish or cherish a history in a way that our predecessors did in Europe and in past civilizations over Europe. There is really just that lack of subject, I think, that people have pointed out lately in the scene, and what comprises that for an actual identity. But I think also that there is that romance of that is part of American culture, is what do you actually bring to the table, what actually works, what are the methods that we could use to see who has the best model, who can compete and have the best model. And there's a lot of charitability that I think is required for that, of course. But I also think that there's something to be said about the lack of regard for intellectual history, which isn't necessarily a bad thing for American identity. But you can see a difference between the European tradition as compared to the American philosophical tradition, where quite frankly these three thinkers in particular aren't nearly well as known as the thinkers of Europe will be or are. But I also think that part of what makes America is that we look for models in eccentric places, and so we don't necessarily just appeal to that intellectual or aristocracy that's just passed down, but actually trying to find modulation and experimentation. I think that to part here that you can perhaps see why America, us as a people, really get so swept up in that sort of Baudrillard would always talk about America being more cinematic than actually upholding some kind of intellectual tradition or long-standing intellectual memory that goes and taps into your ancestors, but this sort of changing cinema based on the workability of those subjects at the time seems much more in line with what America has been and continues to be. But this was just my introduction to American pragmatism, and also giving some cultured thoughts as a whole. I hope you guys enjoyed, and for the next one we'll be looking at Dewey. But thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe to the new channel if you haven't.